Hi everybody, and welcome along to the CfHAS seminar. My name is Richard Twine. I'm a co-director alongside Claire Parkinson of the Centre for Human Animal Studies at Edge Hill University in the northwest of England. And this is our first seminar of this year, this calendar year actually. So we're really excited, and we're kicking things off with a great speaker. So yeah, I'm just going to start off with an introduction, and then I'll hand over to Dinesh to begin his talk. So as many of you know, Dinesh is Associate Professor in Human Rights and Socio-Legal Studies at the University of Sydney. And he's been writing within human animal studies, critical animal studies for over 20 years, and has also written extensively in disability studies. Dinesh is the author of the key book, The War Against Animals, published on the Brill Critical Animal Studies series back in 2015, and is co-editor of the 2015 volume, Animals and the Anthropocene, and the 2016 volume, Foucault and Animals. Dinesh's talk today features material from his new forthcoming book, Animals and Capital, which is due out in October with Edinburgh University Press. And the title of Dinesh's talk today is A Confrontation with Fixed Capital, Lessons from Marx's Value Theory on Animal Agriculture. We're really delighted to have you here, Dinesh, and thanks for working out with the time zones. In Australia, it's in the evening, and it's in the morning in the UK. So hello, everybody, whatever time it might be for you. So yeah, I'm delighted now to hand over to Dinesh.
Hi everyone, and it's really lovely to see so many friends online. Thank you for joining. My thanks to Richard for a really lovely warm welcome, and thanks to Richard and Claire for the invite to talk today, and congrats on all the work you've been doing with the Centre. I actually saw the flyer for the postgrad event yesterday and looked really fantastic. So it's just really exciting to see so much work being done in this space. I want to acknowledge that, as Richard mentioned, I'm in Sydney. I'm on stolen land. I'm on the land of the Wongal people, and I want to pay respects to the owners, the traditional owners of the land, and acknowledge that sovereignty wasn't ceded here. In March 2023, this year, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation featured an expose on the use of carbon dioxide as a stunning technique in the process of slaughtering pigs. The story was the result of undercover work by the organisation Farm Transparency Project, which is an Australian animal advocacy group. In contrast to the industry gloss on the use of CO2 stunning, which claims that, quote, it is the most humane and effective method of managing pig welfare during processing, end quote, the footage portrayed a very different story of animals fighting to survive against an environment that is ruthlessly constructed to kill. CO2 stunning is a collective stun method. Pigs are sent in groups of 4 to 6 into a steel grated enclosure, ironically, or perhaps sardonically, described as a gondola. This gondola is lowered into a dark lake of CO2. The animals react strongly as they violently struggle to breathe against the cage that surrounds them before they lose consciousness. For animal advocates who are routinely confronted by the litany of methods deployed by animal agriculture to make animals suffer, to stun them, to kill them, CO2 stunning is just one more piece of evidence of a prevailing human supremacism which seems unchecked by any sort of moral restraint on its means of violence. However, in the context of this talk, I want to draw attention to aspects of this death ritual that mark out the unique features of the development of CO2 stunning as a technique and mark out its place within capitalist animal agriculture. Pigs present a problem in slaughterhouses because they are resistant to walking single file towards the stun gun. This means that human labour is required to coax animals into the chute, and workers will have to deploy devices such as cattle prods to deal with animals that refuse to comply. CO2 stunning solves some of these difficulties by co-opting that natural tendency of pigs to move in groups by allowing small collectives of animals to enter the steel caged gondola. This reduces human labour time thus speeding the efficiency of production. Secondly, human labour is removed from the whole process of stunning animals. Humans, in fact, are nowhere to be seen. The pigs are lowered alone by the machine into the CO2 lake. This form of stunning thus replaces a messy and hostile entanglement between human and animal with a confrontation directly between animals, machines, and enclosures. I draw attention to these two features of CO2 stunning to highlight two vectors or tendencies that I will argue shape the long-run tendency of capitalist animal agriculture and give shape to the nightmare of the factory farm. These two vectors are, firstly, the removal of human labour time from the scene of production, and secondly, a confrontation orchestrated between animals and what I will call fixed capital, that is machines, technologies, and enclosures. Traditional animal rights theory and advocacy has often centred analysis of the factory farm in relation to our so-called speciesism, or what I would prefer to describe as our hierarchical anthropocentrism. That is a form of anthropocentrism that was developed primarily, but not solely, during the European Enlightenment, which provides a justificatory rationality for the violent human utilisation of non-human animals for food, experimentation, sport, and pleasure. The argument from traditional animal advocacy is that the factory farm represents a kind of zenith of our imagined human supremacy, and that the solution to this dilemma of the violence that this produces is for us to challenge and dismantle this hierarchical anthropocentrism in order to stop this violence and exploitative uses of animals. In my view, this reading is correct, but only partially. I would like to argue instead that if we want to understand the factory farm, we need to comprehend not merely hierarchical anthropocentrism, but also capitalism. Indeed, my argument is that the factory farm represents a brutal meeting point, or a handshake, between hierarchical anthropocentrism and capitalism as two twin forces. This perspective highlights that the modern animal rights movement against the factory farm was a response not just to the cruelty of human supremacism, but instead a response to capitalism taking hold of animals as raw materials, as labour, and as consumption commodities. The book that is forthcoming that Richard mentioned, Animals and Capital, traces what this could mean, including for the potential alignment between animal advocacy and the project of anti-capitalism. In this talk, I would like to focus on one element of the book, which is the application of Karl Marx's labour theory of value to animal agriculture. As we will see, this is a somewhat nerdy endeavour, but I hope, as I'll illustrate, it is instructive in helping us to arrive at a worked out theory to explain the long run tendencies of animal agriculture towards intensification, that is, the historical production of the factory farm. But before I dive into this analysis, I would firstly like to address a question. Why Marx? Animal studies scholars might object to my use of Marx, given the philosopher's poor track record in relation to moral consideration of animals. Certainly, it is well known that Marx was largely antagonistic towards the idea that animals laboured, something we find evidence for both in the early work in the 1844 manuscripts and also in the first two volumes of Capital. Marx, as many people know, was also scathing of animal protection movements. There are a few scholars which have tried to offer Marxist approaches to animal studies. Ted Benton and Barbara Noske are notable early contributors. And arguably, we've seen in the last 5 years some fascinating new scholarship. However, generally, Marxist frameworks are not commonplace in the field. And this is not assisted by the general failure of left and Marxist movements to take seriously animal liberation. As John Sanban-Motsu remarked many years ago, quote, "The views of leftists and rightists converge on the question of animal rights. Both view animal liberation as a danger to established society," end quote. Or more recently, Fahim Amir has economically summarised, quote, "When it comes to animals, the left turns right," end quote. However, and despite these concerns, my interest in Marx is that, in my view, the philosopher continues to provide the most comprehensive and useful analysis of capitalism, and one that has the capacity to highlight structural inequalities, and relations of power that are interconnected with our economic system. Here, Marx's theory of value is important because it unveils the motivating force behind economic relations, and which also happen to be social and political relations. Marx, for example, allows us to see capitalism as a mechanism and organism that has an insatiable drive to overproduce commodities, not because we need them, but because this process of overproduction enables the production of value, which in turn is continually reinvested in order to produce more wealth, something David Harvey describes as a bad infinity. It is not a secret that this bad infinity is one reason why our economic system is taking a wrecking ball to the planet, since the drive to produce value trumps all other values, including the survival of planetary systems. There's a lot we can say about this, what this all means for animals, and my book tries to tell part of this story, including exactly what the use value of animals exactly is for capitalism. But today I want to focus on one aspect of this story, namely how animals figure as labouring subjects within productive processes, and what this might mean for thinking about the application of Marx's value theory to animal agriculture. I'm specifically interested in animals used for food, or what we might describe as food animals. That is, animals who enter production as a raw material and leave as a dead consumption commodity. That is, I'm talking about meat production. For this paper, I'll leave aside other different sorts of production involving animals within agriculture. For example, the work of dairy cows, or animals who are forced to reproduce, that is, perform gestational labour, or draft animals who provide traction within some industries. However, even though I won't focus on all these spheres of work, I will note that in all of these different productive processes, a key question we will see is how we figure the value of animal labour and what this does for our analysis. Allow me to start with a basic description of how Marx sees the production process and the role of labour within it as maintaining value and adding value. So let me just share my slides. Oh, hang on. I need to be able to share my slides, Richard.
Claire, can you grant Dinesh the power, or can I?
You should be able to do it, Richard, I think. There we go. You just try now, Dinesh.
Thank you. Yep, I've got it.
Thanks, Claire.
Here we go. I hope that everyone can see that.
Yeah, thanks. So
in order to illustrate this, I'm going to share a typical description in Capital Volume 1. Please don't freak out by this particular quote because it's dense, but I'm going to try and explain it. So here goes the quote. While the productive labour is changing the means of production into constituent elements of a new product, their value undergo a transmigration. And Marx uses the phrase, the word Seelenwanderung, which means the movement of the soul. It deserts the consumed body to occupy the new created one. But this transmigration takes place, as it were, behind the back of the actual labour process. The worker is unable to add new labour to create new value without at the same time preserving old values, because the labour he adds must be of a specific useful kind, and he cannot do work of a useful kind without employing products as the means of production of a new product, and thereby transferring their value to a new product. The property, therefore, which labour power in action, living labour, possesses of preserving value at the same time as it adds it, is a gift of nature which costs the worker nothing, but is very advantageous to the capitalist since it preserves the existing value of his capital, end quote. This is a complex quote, so please allow me to unpack it. For human labour, this means that labour works on an object of production that is distinct from one's own body, and this process consumes a use value and simultaneously through this labour produces a new use value which contains the old use value within it. To take an example, think about the process of producing a table. A worker, for example, sands a table. but must in the process of sanding the table maintain the old value in the table, i.e. not destroy the table through this work, while simultaneously adding value through the sanding work. Here the money owner, the owner of capital or the boss, trusts the worker with the object of production. The worker faithfully does not damage the value of the object of production, while at the same time transforming it into something which is with the new use value that does not resemble the old. The soul of the object of production moves, as it were, seamlessly to a new object with a new use value, even if this object itself appears as one and the same. The table moves through production and is transformed by the application of labour into something with a new use value. So the table that was previously coarse is sanded and is produced into something that's maybe usable after being sanded. For Marx, this process is central to capitalist production. The motivation for capitalism is to engage in production, not because we need the commodity, but because of the value that can be gleaned from the production process. As is familiar to those who know Marx's analysis, under capitalism, the human worker is paid less than the value they produce during this production process. The capitalist takes this difference between the wage and the value produced, that is the surplus, as their own, and is motivated to overproduce commodities because of the massive surplus that can be gained. There are, of course, numerous issues with Marx's description of the production process. Relevant to this paper, this narrative offered of labour in this context is highly disembodied. It fails to account for labour where the object of production might be, for example, the body of the labourer themselves. There is hence immediately a challenge here for thinking about animals as labourers in food systems. Since for food animals, these animals will be required to labour on themselves, their own bodies, to produce themselves as commodities. However, we have many resources available by which we can correct Marx's understanding of the character of labour within capitalist production. One important source for this corrective is feminist labour theory, which has advanced analyses of forms of bodily work, such as care labour or sex work, or gestational labour, including commercial surrogacy. For example, Amrita Panda's analysis of commercial surrogacy as labour is very useful for understanding the metabolic labour that animals might be compelled to perform within production. So referring to commercial surrogacy, Pandey notes, and I quote, "Surrogacy is an extreme example of the manifestation of worker embodiment, where body is the ultimate site of labour, where the resources, the skills, and the ultimate product are derived primarily from the body of the labourer. The worker's embodiment is essentially living in the commodity produced, literally in the form of the worker's bodily fluids, her blood, and her sweat." This conceptualization of bodily or metabolic labour is very useful in relation to its application to the kind of work food animals might do in production, where the animal's own body, their own blood and sweat, will be poured into the commodity that will be produced as a result of this production process. This sort of perspective pushes us to question some fundamental categories in Marx, though. For Marx, capital enters the production process as either constant capital, that is a raw material, or an instrument of labour or a technology, or as variable capital, that is labour power, which, quote, both reproduces the equivalent of its own value and simultaneously produces an excess, a surplus value, end quote. This perspective of Marx's maintains a hard division between labour power and everything else in production. As we shall see, the understanding of an animal labour force changes how we view the separation between constant and variable capital, as food animals are asked to embody both. In Marx's traditional description of the production process, fixed capital, circulating capital, and labour time come together to make a new use value or a new product. Fixed capital refers to instruments such as tools, enclosures, or machines. Circulating capital refers to the raw materials that are used in the production process, such as the wood that is used to make a table. Labour time refers to the period of time that labour time is expended to produce a new value. And the product is the commodity that emerges at the end of the process, which embodies this new use value. In value terms, this could be represented as follows. So this is a basic kind of formula that describes how Marx would see the production process. The product is the combination of fixed capital, circulating capital, and labour time. Relevant to my analysis, Marx is very clear that labour time, the definite period for the expenditure of labour power, relates only to human labour. Animals here in the traditional Marxist analysis only appear on the side of constant capital. Food animals will be treated in a traditional sense as circulating capital, raw materials to be worked towards a product with a new use value. That is the capital item that embodies a previous expenditure of human labour, which is gradually transformed in the production process through the application of human labour time. However, treating animals not merely as circulating commodities, but also as labour complicates this picture. This is because we must allow for the unique position of animals as both capital assets that are worked on and simultaneously as labouring subjects who, at least in the case of food animals, are forced to work on themselves. What if we suggest that food animals enter the production process as a hybrid of both constant and variable capital? In this view, food animals are deployed as both a raw material that will be finished by the production process and simultaneously as labour that must work on itself through a metabolic self-generative work which adds value. This is labour in the sense Marx understood. That is, animals have labour power that is deployed for a definite time with the aim of generating surplus above the specific times, the time-specific costs of the reproduction of that labour. For the economics of food production, as we'll see, it is vital that animals reproduce their own value in themselves as a raw material and simultaneously as labour without injuring the original raw material so as to ensure their transformation into a new use value. In a simple sense, animals must survive production and simultaneously they must add value to themselves in order for the commodity to be produced. If we were to imagine the incorporation of animal labour, the fundamentals remain the same. The product requires a combination of capital and labour time. However, the fine detail alters. We must allow for the inclusion of animal value as a raw material that enters the production process to be worked on, differentiated from other circulating capital items such as animal feed and water, and differentiated from fixed capital such as machines used in production or fixtures of production in animal agriculture such as barns, fences, and other containment facilities. But we must also allow for animal labour, that is the definite expenditure of animal labour time to be part of the production process, which must be differentiated from human labour time. This leaves us with the following. So here we see a variation on the formula. Note that this formula does not deviate substantially from Marx's formulation that the product is merely the combination of capital and labour time. All that we have done is separate the two lives of food animals in production as both circulating capital and labour time, i.e. a hybrid of constant and variable capital. However, what does differ is that by insisting on identifying specifically the role of animals as both raw material and a source of labour simultaneously, the formula I'm describing allows us to observe a number of curiosities associated with how we might understand an animal-based industry, such as one that produces animals as food products. At least one thing the formula allows us to see is that the social relationship between factors of production, human and non-human, shifts remarkably depending on how far animal agriculture processes are intensified and mechanised. In other words, we can glimpse the conditions for animal agriculture both before and after the arrival of the factory farm. Let me explain. Under non-industrialised conditions of production, when there is low involvement of machinery and tools, i.e. fixed capital, in the production of animals, then the business of creating the animal as a food commodity requires a low fixed capital intensity. However, there will be a high degree of human labour time involved. The lack of automated processes means that humans must be present instead to facilitate animal labour processes. There will also be a high degree of animal labour here too, in the form of the metabolic labour involved by animals in producing themselves, that is staying nourished, growing, moving, developing muscle, etc. That will enable a final product, that is meat. Here is a formula for low fixed capital intensity animal agriculture system. Here, fixed capital is minimised. In fact, in this example, I've completely erased it. There are relatively few capital items, humans, machines, fences, that mediate the relationship between humans and animals. Instead, for example, where a farmer uses commonly owned land as pasture for grazing, there's a direct relationship between human labour time, which I've represented as LT here, and animals as circulating capital or raw material, as CCA, and the manipulation of the conditions by which animals can expend labour power, or LTA. In this case, this low capital intensity labour environment of animal agriculture will look mostly as a close relationship between humans and animals, perhaps what is often romanticised as the traditional pre-industrial pastoral shepherd-flock relation. This also tells us something about the respective character of human labour versus animal labour in these production processes. Human labour in animal agriculture aims to generate and enforce and extract animal labour. Humans are paid a wage to dominate animals in order to compel an animal labour that allows the animal to produce their own body as a product. This imperative shapes human labour tasks, which are designed to compel this specific form of animal labour, including husbandry and reproductive controls, feeding and nutrition regimes, herding animals under the fear of the whip or the dog's bite, forced body modifications including sterilisation, removal of the body organs or bodily identification regimes such as branding. In other words, human labour time here aims to generate the animal as a self-labouring subject. Animals are compelled to obey the metabolic regime imposed upon them in order to realise themselves as a product to be sold. Domination is the overall characteristic of this relationship. And here I would say that this is in contrast to imaginings that this sort of labour environment is about co-workers working together in some sort of happy relationship. In a situation of low fixed capital intensity production, e.g. the pastoral shepherd-flock relation, then human labour time is required to perform the tasks of domination, which aim at compelling animal labour time, which is aimed at producing the product. Okay, so what happens when animal agriculture intensifies? That is, what happens when the factory farm materialises. The intensification of production is accompanied by an expansion in fixed capital in animal agriculture. Intensive enclosures, industrial scale feeding systems, systems for getting rid of waste, industrialised forms of breeding, forms of automation applied everywhere, including slaughter, as well as an expansion of circulating capital, such as food, water, and pharmaceuticals, essential to the production of animals. This intensive animal agriculture scenario also signals the massive expansion in animals as raw materials. More and more animals are required to enter the system to produce more and more meat, which of course is basically the story of animal agriculture in the 20th century and beyond. While it is true that animals have expanded as raw materials, my analysis also signals their expansion as workers. That is, there is a massive expansion of animal labour time required to produce ever more product. Indeed, the only thing that relatively decreases in this scenario of capital intensification is human labour time. As human labour productivity increases, create efficiencies that save on the mass of human labour. That is, as Marx would describe it, there's an increase in the technical composition of capital. As we know, producers are globally working towards fully automated processes in animal agriculture, which effectively remove all human labour from the equation. Under a system of imagined full automation of animal agriculture, this scenario looks something like this. The image, by the way, is of an industrial aquaculture facility where, as you can see, humans are nowhere, which is typical of many forms of industrial aquaculture. And as you can see from the formula, the variation here is that human labour time has been completely removed from the equation. It is here that I wish to flag the potential of the application of Marx's value theory for understanding the trajectories of animal agriculture. But it is also here where we start to see the limits of the anthropocentrism of Marx's analysis, as it reveals the difference between the relationship between labour time and capital, depending on whether human or non-human labour is deployed. In Marx's story, a rising technical composition of capital, that is the rise of fixed capital, puts humans out of work by reducing human labour time and increasing the presence of machines and raw materials in productive processes. That is, rising human labour productivity is driven by technological developments and a rising investment in machinery. Thus, we are told full automation will effectively dispense with the need for direct inputs of human labour time. But if we include animal labour into the story, we get a completely different picture. It is true that intensification of animal agriculture has led to an explosion in the capital contribution to production in the form of fixed capital and circulating raw materials, including massive flows of living animals into production as raw materials. However, animal labour time also expands in this scenario. Indeed, as total human labour time diminishes within the productive process, total animal labour time would seem to expand almost proportionately with the expansion in the total production of animal products. And this labour in turn generates a need for more circulating capital, feed, water, antibiotics, etc., that are essential for animals to consume as part of their labour to realise value. In this context, it seems appropriate to unpack the meaning of animal labour time here. And certainly it is at this point that we must temporarily depart from Marx as a foundation for this thinking. This is because this labour operates according to different biopolitical rationalities from human wage labour, which was always biopolitical, albeit regulated through the prism of the monetary wage. During that long, spiralling but central chapter on the working day in Marx's Capital Volume 1, we get a strong sense of the contestation within capitalism over what the working day for humans looks like, and how capital struggled to increase the length of the working day. They struggled against social norms and worker resistance to increase the hours that workers worked, and then struggled to use other means, including efficiency gains, to compel labour to be more productive within the social limits placed on the working day. Here, the strategies of capital are to either or both make workers work longer hours, or alternatively, make human labour more efficient by intensifying it or replacing it. For animals, this situation is completely different and unpredicted by Marx's analysis. Labour time is not normatively constrained within any given day for animals. There is no working day for animals. They don't go home at the end of the day. Instead, the confines of this labour process are dictated by life and are bookended by non-life. Within the value chains of animal food production, life is the time of production. Death is configured as the value-producing moment. It is when production ends. It is when death arrives that the living commodity ceases existence as a raw material and attains a use value as a commodity. This means, in essence, the production process is equivalent to life. For food animals, the whole of life is subsumed within production, so that all labour time is equivalent to the fact of living and will only reach its completion at slaughter. For food animals, labour time is not regulated, therefore, by the normative limits imposed on the working day. Instead, labour time equals lifetime. Chicken labour time, for example, equals the short time that the chicken is alive. This is exactly how much labour time is required from the chicken themselves to produce the chicken as a product. The fact that animal lives are completely captured by capitalist production shapes the nature of attempts to wrest more value from this labour. The tendency of productive processes towards increasing relative surplus value is to reduce labour time for the production of the same use value. For humans, this means that average labour time to produce consumption items such as food, televisions, and automobiles has progressively been reduced through the introduction of machines, technologies, and techniques. Human labour time has often been replaced by machines or fixed capital. However, this option is not available when we examine animal labour within capitalist food systems. This is because animals are themselves the product. In order for capitalist agriculture to overproduce commodities, that is to pursue capitalism's strategy of overproduction in order to generate a surplus, then animals must be overproduced as raw materials. That is, there must be an overproduction of forced gestational labour, which in turn makes new animals available for production. And then these overproduced raw materials are forced to labour upon themselves so that they will eventually become a mass of commodities at the end of the production process. That is, enable an overproduction of meat. Here, animals cannot be replaced because they are the raw material, they are the labour, and they are the product. However, capitalist animal agriculture has produced other strategies to reduce animal labour time. And it is here that we start to see how a value perspective, if applied consistently to animal labour, allows us to recognise the coordinates of the factory farm. If you can't expand, reduce, or eliminate the working day for animals, since their whole life is captured by production, then increasing surplus value is possible through one other route, namely by shortening life. This is familiar to us and has been part and parcel of the intensification of animal agriculture. For example, over the last 50 years, broiler chickens have been genetically selected to effectively halve growing time. This has led to the perverse situation where animals are bred to grow faster in order to die quicker, reducing the production phase. Therefore, literally through the shortening of life, it is possible to shorten animal labour time. Indeed, if we take animal labour time seriously, then we can see that this tendency would inevitably materialise in capitalist animal agriculture. We cannot extend the working day of animals longer than 24 hours. Instead, though, we can shorten lives and thus reduce the production phase. The other route where value can be attained is through intensification and production efficiencies. In the case of human labour, additional value can be attained by asking workers to do more in the same amount of time, or alternatively, in the expansion of techniques and technologies which lift the productivity of labour. These same pressures have shaped animal agriculture, particularly in relation to the focus on maximising the productivity of inputs into animal agriculture, such as feed, water, and pharmaceuticals, in order to maximise the value of outputs. As our host, Richard Twine, summarises, if we think about the biopower of animal science broadly and not just genetics, we see an approach to the bodies of pigs, cattle, chicken, and sheep that is about the precise and economically efficient control of inputs in order to try and control a particular qualitatively standardised meat, milk, or fibre product, end quote. From a value perspective, I would suggest that the tendency of animal agriculture will be towards maximising the efficiency of animal labour time so that value produced exceeds the costs of the reproduction of that labour. We actually see this expressed in a quite brutal way within the focus of animal agriculture on so-called yield or conversion rates. Intensification has driven the industry to develop accurate calculations around yield conversion rates, which are, my slide has disappeared, which are described as, quote, a mathematical construct based on the component variables of body weight, weight gain, feed intake, and possibly some measure of body fatness that is meant to convey the ability of an individual to convert nutrients obtained from available feed into useful product, end quote. Thus, precise and imperious control over feed and the conditions for their conversion into weight, that is the conditions for animal labour on their own bodies to metabolize this feed, will determine profitability. In other words, feed conversion rates effectively pin down the cost of capital for the animal's reproduction of their own labour. There is one final aspect of this production process I would like to discuss today, namely the confrontation between animals and fixed capital that marks out capitalist animal agriculture. For Marx, the fundamental antagonisms that shaped early capitalism between human workers and machines arose as a result of the sense that machines were replacing the labour and livelihoods of workers. As such, the antagonism between the human worker and the machine is often described as one of competition. And we see this playing out today, certainly in the public debate over artificial intelligence, particularly in the anxiety over whether AI will either enhance or potentially, and most likely, replace jobs. For animals, however, this antagonism takes on a completely different character. Food animal labour cannot be replaced by inorganic machines, since these animals are not only labour power, but they are also raw material and finished product. Instead, the arrival of machines in the factory farm is merely the replacement of the antagonistic relationality between humans and animals in animal agriculture with a new hostility, this time between animals and machines. Where animal resistance might previously have been directed against human workers whose labour power aimed at making animals productive, that is, making animals labour, intensified production instead shifts this relation to the technologies of control. It is the machine that now confronts the animal as a force of domination aimed at compelling labour, right up until the point where the value can be realised through death. The increasing intensification of animal agriculture, including progress towards full automation, means that animal labour now increasingly faces an environment where capital everywhere dominates. Patterns of birth are completely overcome by mechanised processes. Every aspect of the environment becomes enclosed within weaponised, aversive living spaces determined by economic necessity. And animals are moved between phases in the value chain, including to death, through automated processes which chase them down, shackle them, and drive them towards the death of value realisation. In this regard, I would argue that industrial animal agriculture has not only been a product of the need to save human labour, but also a product of the confrontation between fixed capital and the valuable labour of animals. Since animals are the product, their labour cannot be dispensed with in the way human labour can be replaced. On the contrary, this animal labour is central since it is the product, so capital must seek to dominate it in ever more intensive ways. Hence the factory farm, which is a site of conflict between animals and fixed capital. Here we can see that the factory farm is a production not just of anthropocentrism, nor just of capitalism, but the nightmare produced by both material realities. We can also see that while that much focus of contemporary animal studies is on the human-animal relation, that in fact the mainstay direct relation we should perhaps be focusing on under capitalism is that between animals and fixed capital, machines, enclosures and technologies, all of which have been developed with the open purpose of domination, injury and death. I'm going to stop share for a second, just to finish up. In conclusion, I would like to highlight the usefulness of Marx's value theory for making sense of animal agriculture. Orthodox Marxists may be, and may continue to be, perturbed by my own use of the value theory, including my insistence that animals enter production as both a raw material and a source of labour power. However, in my view, insisting on this is illuminating, both in understanding the history, present and future of animal agriculture, but also in shedding light in a structural sense on the relation between capitalism and the form of the factory farm. From a value perspective, we can note two tendencies within capitalist animal agriculture. Firstly, a drive to shorten lives. Second, a drive to expand yield, that is to maximise the value produced by animal labour time above and over the cost of the reproduction of that labour. Both tendencies respond to the concrete problem of animal labour, which is also a raw material and must be the end product. Both tendencies tell us about the core characteristics of the factory farm and also tell us about the future, i.e. that producers will continue their quest to shorten animal lives and maximise yield. For advocates, understanding these characteristics tells us where the industry will go and where we might tactically intervene. We can further note that the factory farm is a historical production, not just of anthropocentrism, but also of capitalism. Indeed, in bearing witness to the horrific collision between fixed capital and animal life that the factory farm represents, we are observing a historically unprecedented handshake between these two forces, a hierarchical anthropocentrism that makes animal bodies available for exploitation without apparent limit, and an economic system that seeks, through overproduction and continuing application of efficiencies, to extract endless surplus from these lives. In my view, there's a lesson here for advocates too, as in taking on the factory farm, we are not merely responding to the problem of human supremacy, but also responding to capitalism and its production process. Arguably, animal advocacy has always responded to animals as they were historically situated by capitalism. Perhaps there is scope here for the development of animal advocacy specifically as a form of anti-capitalism. We should not ignore that this possibility emerges at exactly the point at which a range of social movements are asking critical questions about the injustices of capitalism, including radical environmental movements today, highlighting the incompatibility between our economic system and the survival of planetary systems. This highlights that modern animal advocacy movements have their own story to tell about the history of capitalism, and at stake in this question is the future of our prevailing economic system. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dinesh. It's great. I can see some virtual applause.
Thanks all.
Spreading throughout the virtual space. Would anybody like to ask a question or to make a comment about the talk? Is that Corey Wren with her hand up by any chance? Looks like it might be. Yeah.
Hi, Corey.
Hey, what a fascinating talk. I'm furiously over here typing notes. It's really, really exciting stuff. And kudos to you for diving deep into Marxist theory and doing that hard work that will benefit all of us. My question is, of course, you sort of left it open-ended at the end there about the implications for advocacy. And as I'm sure you're aware, there's also a bit of research that's now emerging about the commodification of veganism and how, we really need to start thinking about expanding this capitalist critique to our advocacy approaches as far as, what does it mean when veganism now, for instance, I just did a content analysis of British media from 2020, 2021. And while veganism had exploded in popularity. I was replicating a study from 10 years previous, and it went from about 400 mentions in a year to 40,000. But when I did a content analysis of that, only 1 out of 400 some articles that I coded actually significantly mentioned animal rights and animal ethics. The rest was just about buy this new stuff. It's completely divorced from, the political movement that we are. So I was wondering what your thoughts are as far as, taking what you've built out of this Marxist, or updating Marx, basically. How can we actually put that into our advocacy, and what are the warnings there about not having a critique of capitalism and just say as long as it's vegan? What do you think?
A great question, Corey, and thank you. There's actually, in the forthcoming book, I do spend some time thinking about veganism, and the findings are mixed. And I say this as a vegan, so I'm a long-time vegan, and the findings are mixed in the sense that I guess one thing I'd point to is that one thing the Marxist analysis points to is that what happens in the sphere of consumption doesn't necessarily guide what happens in the sphere of production. And we know this because if we follow through the analysis from Marx, the motive driving production under capitalism is the extraction of surplus. And what this means isn't necessarily the sale of goods at the end, but the overproduction of commodities as a means of producing profit. And we know this because this is destroying the planet. Basically, this logic destroys the planet as we speak. In this respect, I think one challenge for veganism is that it is potentially part of this same problem. So the campaigns to increase plant-based foods, which we all want, all of us vegans want this, right? It potentially just is in concert with the strategies of capitalism to just overproduce commodities. And if we look at food consumption globally, we know that per capita food consumption continues to rise, including in the global north. And arguably, all that has happened is diversification of the overproduction of food commodities per capita. And maybe veganism is complicit in this. And that's not a reason to not be vegan. I think there's political reasons why veganism is important. But what it highlights is that we need a production politics at the same time. We need a politics that is focused on what are we going to do with production. One thing I'd say that to me is interesting about the history of the modern animal rights movement is that on one hand, the animal rights movement has actually had a production politics in that the focus of lots of animal advocacy is about stopping production. It's actually closing down the factory farm. So it's not a purely consumption-based movement. But one thing I note is that it differs from the goals of lots of left politics, which is often about taking control of production. And to me, that's actually where we need to be heading. We need to be talking about how do we take control over food production? And I think that to me is where some of the most exciting work needs to happen is we need to be in the conversation. Like the IPCC has basically said we need to change our food systems. So we will see a growing agenda, and Richard and others know this, there's huge barriers to actually affecting change in our food systems. But from my perspective, we need to be part of the global debate about what that food system will look like. And that's a production politics. So that's something different from veganism. But I also want to just stress that veganism might have other purposes as a strategy or praxis or practice of our movements. But there's definitely a problem if we only focus our energies on consumption, because in some ways that actually fits the strategy of capitalism itself, which is the overproduction of commodities that might include the overproduction of plant-based food, and it won't solve the problem.
Thanks very much, Dinesh. Got a question from Ruth. Abby.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to pick up very briefly on the very graphic description that you started with. I also live in Australia, and I attended a demonstration against that pig gassing on the steps of the Victorian Parliament. And one of the consequences is that one of the sites has been shut down. Chris Delforce, who runs the Farm Transparency Group, tried to get the Minister for Agriculture to come out and say that she endorsed this practice, and she's refused to. So the pressure is happening, but it also speaks to the point that you ended up on, which is about the connection between veganism and food production. The Animal Justice Party in Australia is really strong on that. I mean, it's a delicate thing for them to push too hard, but they do push hard. And one of the people who's taken this up has been the elected member for the AJP in the Victorian Parliament. So they are very, very conscious of food production and the deleterious effect the systems have on animals, on humans, on climate. So I think some of the things that you're calling for are happening in some smaller local ways, and it might be really encouraging for people to hear about this, just as I said, as some sort of antidote to, I mean, I nearly had to just mute you while you were describing that, because it's so, I mean, it's so correct, but it's just so graphic and horrific. And as you say, the Farm Transparency Project is really making a lot of noise about this.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. And it was a struggle to even know whether to include the description. I was actually going to show just an image of the gondola, but I just couldn't even look at it. Right? It's just full on. But hopefully...
At the demonstration that I was at, they played recordings of the pigs screaming while they were dying that Chris Delforce and others had made at the site.
Yeah. Again, the reason I wanted to share that story is that to me, it illustrates a logic that maybe we could have predicted. Like if we followed through the logic of what capitalism and agriculture will do, that's where it ends. And it will continue, right, unless we stop it. Thanks for that. I agree that there's some really interesting stuff going on, and I've been really impressed by some of the messaging of different animal advocacy groups, including the AJP, on some of this stuff. One thing I'd just say, just stepping back from all of this, is that, and I flagged this at the end of the talk, that I genuinely think we're at a point where lots of different social movements are asking deep questions about capitalism. And I mentioned climate change and radical environmental movements who make the clear point that actually all of our ambitions to mitigate climate warming are just not possible unless we radically change our economic system. At the same time, you have anti-colonial movements and Black Lives Matter movement highlighting the interconnections between colonial legacies and racial capitalism. At the same time, there's these questions around automation and lots of radicals sort of saying, well, does this mean we can actually reduce labour time and also reduce the amount of shit we're producing on the planet, right? So I think there's a lot going on, and one of the ambitions of the book was to insert animal advocates into that discussion, into that radical discussion about where is our economic system going, and remind us that we actually have a distinct story to tell. So the book is actually written both for animal advocates and actually for leftists. It's actually to try and get leftists to take the cause of animals seriously. Thanks, Ruth.
Colin.
Hi, everyone. So thank you, Dinesh. Really always interesting to listen to you elaborate on some ideas and really get us thinking about things. So a sort of question, I don't want to put you on the spot a little bit. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on hierarchical anthropocentrism and sort of your distinction between that and just, I'll just say everyday anthropocentrism. But linking that to perhaps, and this is the bit might put you on the spot a little bit, so this shift to think about relations of capital or capitalism, technologies, production, and the cage, and that sort of focus. And do you think, have you thought how that might be useful in thinking about debates about cross-cultural disputes or perspectives across cultures on how animals are incorporated and or used in societies, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Yes. So thanks, Colin. Nice to see you, by the way. Yes, I think so. One thing that strikes me about some of those discussions about how do we use animals across culture, and maybe hopefully I've got this right in terms of some of the predictable pushback that we get around, say, plant-based food politics, where people are saying, well, you're infringing my cultural rights by forcing particular food practices on me. Is that where you're heading, Colin, with that?
Yeah, so that's one part of it, but also the other side where you'll often see Western countries sort of telling other countries what to do while they're not cleaning up their own mess first, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So a bit of both.
Yeah, so I think it tells us two different things. One thing is that I think if we look at the history, both colonialism was an epistemic project that created particular ways of using animals. So that doesn't mean that anthropocentrism only existed in the European Enlightenment, but we see this interconnection, and it's, you know, people like Claire Jean Kim have traced this sort of genealogy, right? That this sort of hierarchical anthropocentrism that we get from the European Enlightenment starts to actually become the main game of how most people view animals, and I'd say this is part of the colonial project. The second aspect of this is that capitalism has demonstrably changed consumption patterns across the planet. And we just have to look at the data. Per capita meat consumption just grows almost everywhere, and in ways that actually demolish traditional ways of using animals. So again, one thing I'd just say about it is that the kind of description I'm putting forward about trying to look at the handshake between hierarchical anthropocentrism and capitalism is a history that has fundamentally shaped patterns of consumption that actually have been part of the demolition of cultures. And I think that that's a useful perspective in some of these debates about, should we, you know, if we encourage people to move to plant-based diets, will this be moving against cultural rights and things like that? It's sort of like, well, cultural rights have been actually demolished by both this sort of Enlightenment conceptions about how we're going to use animals and capitalism. But the second question about pointing the finger, and I think that's exactly right. So I think one danger certainly of some vegan politics is a kind of cultural imperialism that misses that actually the driver for mass devastation is tied up with exactly the processes that I've described, like this sort of anthropocentrism tied with a capitalist production process. And the winners in this game financially it's not evenly distributed globally. So I think that helps to shape how we interact with some of these questions. I know I gave a bit of a garbled answer, but I hope that made sense.
Thank you.
Any other hands up before I get really selfish and ask my own question? Okay. Yeah. I was just going to ask about, I don't know, this is probably just like a really minor point, but about genetics, because when you were talking about intensification a couple of times, you reeled off feed, water, and pharmaceuticals, antibiotics, and those kinds of things. I was just thinking about how genetics is also probably should be maybe more explicit in that list for some of the ways in which animals have been selected to have more musculature, to produce more lean meat and this kind of stuff, because this seems to be like also like replacing the animal labor time. So it's actually the work of animal science. So it's actually adding human labor time in the expansion of this infrastructure of animal science, which is a global kind of endeavor. And it's removing some of the animal labor time through various genetic selections. Although then there are other examples of genetic selections which say are about increasing the litter sizes of pigs, for example, which then also you could read that as actually increasing the labor time of animals, of female animals in particular. And I suppose there's a specification to be teased out, isn't there, about female animals and male animals, and in terms of labor as well. So I just wondered if you had any comments on that.
That's a great question, and one that I wish I had some of your expertise around. So I avidly read your book. I'd say that, I mean, it isn't just necessarily about shortening animal labor time, it's actually making animal labor time more efficient. And phrasing it that way could mean that in some cases, say shortening the life of an animal through genetic selection is the strategy. Other times, as you described, it might be about making the productivity of that animal more efficient, right? So both, but the goal is, of course, making labor time more efficient. That's, so capital has various strategies to do that, or capitalism has various strategies to do that. But one reason I want to emphasize that framing is that the traditional Marxist framing would be humans do the work and this labor is embedded into the animal. Like that's the usual framing from Marxism, is that only humans do this work. And so in this case, the animal scientists do the work and their labor is embodied in the value of the animal. The framing I want to propose is that, no, all of this is about animal labor time. It's actually about making animal labor time more efficient. And it's precisely that interaction that produces value. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think that's a great question. And maybe it's something you and I can chat about sometime, so I can better understand some of the genetic stuff, which I don't fully, not an expert on.
Thanks very much. I don't know who was first, Tom or Alistair, but I'll go with Tom first.
Hi, Richard. There we go.
Hi, Tom.
Oh my God, my hair looks terrible.
Looks fantastic, Tom.
I was first over Alistair, but I'm aware there were a couple of questions in the chat that were definitely there before me.
We can come back to those, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dinesh. That was a really great talk, as ever. I love a good formula. So my question's about your formulas or the apparatus around your formulas. So you maintain a sort of sharp distinction between the human-animal distinction using your codes. And you were very persuasive in demonstrating how that worked, I thought, in the example you chose, intensive farming. And I'm just wondering if you wanted to say, or I wanted to ask you to say a little bit about whether you'd want to maintain that qualitative distinction between human labour time and animal labour time, and the other one as well. In all contexts, especially given what some of the authors you drew on, like Panda, suggest, and whether there are some contexts where maintaining that distinction is not so useful. You mentioned a few that you weren't going to deal with. So I'm basically asking you to talk about the things you said you weren't going to talk about, or think about those a little bit. And you briefly mentioned about the wage element, and I'm wondering how significant that is for humans, whether that's a crucial distinction between the two different forms. That was a bit ill-formed, sorry, but
no, it's good. So one, yeah, that's great question, Tom. So let's start with the wage. One issue we have with the wage, the monetary wage, is that some people and some Marxists will read this as proxy for non-coerced labour. So a wage is paid and you sign an agreement, and this is a kind of freedom associated with it. And I actually think this is a mistaken reading of Marx. So for Marx, the whole point of capitalism is that labour is, the labour that we do for a wage is, in most cases, far from free. And he makes this very clear in numerous sections of Capital. We are forced to labour because we've got nothing else to sell but our labour in order to survive. So what is the wage in this context? Well, the wage is currency that's paid to the worker, usually set at a low level so they can never afford to buy capital in their lifetime. But it allows the worker to make some choices over the means of consumption so that they can survive and reproduce their labour and turn up to work the next day. That's precisely what the wage is functioning to do. I guess my analysis would point to the fact that actually capitalism has different strategies to deal with the problem of how labour is going to be reproduced within production. For some humans, and not all, the wage is the technology that is used. For animals, it's through the use of yield conversion rates, where a precise amount of feed and water and pharmaceuticals, etc., is thrown in as kind of circulating capital. And this enables a production of value by the animal that exceeds their reproduction costs. And so from that perspective, in the book, I put forward the view that the wage is just one technology of capital, and it's one that is used for some human workers, not all, as a means to control the reproductive costs of labour. And we shouldn't fetishize it in that regard, actually. And in the book, I talk about this amusing exchange. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations put forward the idea that when a horse is fed grain, this is their wage. And then Marx in Capital Volume 2 makes fun of Adam Smith. And I guess I make the point that actually I think Smith is onto something. There's something about, because Smith is understanding the grain as the means for the reproduction of the horse's labour, just as the wage is the means for the reproduction of the worker's labour. Just in relation to the qualitative difference, the one reason I wanted to maintain the difference between human and animal labour is because I want to make the point that there's a structural difference in position between humans and animals. That is that food animals, at least in my view, represent a distinct economic class in a kind of sociological sense. One reason I argue this is that, as I mentioned, food animals enter production as a hybrid of both constant and variable capital, while wage labourers are just simply variable capital. And that's one important distinction. The second is, as I illustrate in the talk, typically in animal agriculture, human labour is basically focused around making animals labour. So it's not, so, you know, I know that some like Haraway and Porcher make this argument of this sort of co-working, mingling between humans and animals to produce something. In my view, actually, this misses that actually this is an antagonistic relationship. Humans are employed to dominate animals and make them labour. That's precisely the flow of production. In this, I want to actually make the point, and this is also central to a Marxist analysis, that we're talking about a structural relation that is antagonistic in nature. And what I mean by antagonism is that the terms of freedom for one element within that antagonistic relationship rely on the complete subordination and domination of the other element. You can't free one element and allow the other to enjoy freedom. And to me, I can't see how we can contest this when we look at most of our uses of animals. And this goes back to my earlier work. I think if we look at animal agriculture or experimentation, most of the ways that humans use animals are about this antagonistic relationship of domination, where it's not possible to imagine animal freedom because that means the end of human freedom in that context, the way that human freedom is being constructed. So from my perspective, actually it's important to maintain the difference. But I recognize that maybe at an ontological or philosophical level, we might want to just blur some of these distinctions, right, in terms of analysis. But for the political analysis I'm doing, I want to highlight, actually, this is antagonistic. And of course, this is directed at some of the scholarship in the field, which I think has tried to grapple with Marx and has often done so in ways that I think have missed that domination and antagonism as central to value production.
Fantastic. You've
Thanks,
convinced me.
Thank you. Alistair.
Hi, Alistair. It's been a long time.
Hey, Dinesh. Hey, everyone. I just wanted to say, Tom, your hair looks fine. Dinesh, your hair looks great as well. So
Thank you.
Well, it always looks fabulous.
Whilst we're on that point, can I just draw attention to the fantastic coordination that you've managed to pull off, Dinesh, between your shirt and your wallpaper? I know Alistair wanted to say that, but I've got it before him.
I thought about it and thought, should I do it? Should I? And then I did.
It's distracting though. I've been thinking of it the whole time. But no, yeah, Dinesh, thank you for that amazing talk. You bring into focus the fact that the problem facing animals is not humans, but capitalism, right? And so and you make the argument that, you know, animal advocacy must become anti-capitalist, right? To put it in kind of simple terms. And I agree with this. But, you know, integrating animal advocacy into let's say the project of anti-capitalism presents, you know, a number of opportunities, especially in terms of synergy between different struggles, right? That are involved in this project of anti-capitalism. But an anti-capitalist animal advocacy also seems to present certain kinds of challenges, right? You noted Fahim Amir's, you know, pithy sort of, you know, point that when it comes to animals, the left turns right, you know, and even, you know, at a scholarly level, there's going to be lots of opposition to basic things about your analysis, right, of animal labor, right? The very notion of animal labor, as you noted, is, you know, wouldn't be taken seriously by most Marxists. So I just wanted to get you to reflect upon what you think are some of the main opportunities and main challenges facing, you know, this broader project of, you know, trying to integrate animal advocacy into the kind of anti-capitalist struggle, or if that's even how you see it. Yeah.
No, that's great question. And I wish I had the solutions. I can give it a go. So let me just start with, let's start with something that just feels like the status quo of some advocacy. So one view would be, we keep going down the consumption route. So we tell everybody veganism is the answer. We convince capitalism to overproduce vegan plant-based foods. And we hope that at some point, Bill Gates will fund whatever, some replacement meat or whatever it is that will eliminate capitalist animal agriculture. Maybe it's true, right? Maybe at some point things will click and we'll stop doing what we're doing. I'm going to put, I guess I would make another gamble, which is that capitalism as an economic system is fraught with contradiction, injustice, and is on a collision course with the survival of the planet. And I I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but I imagine the next 50 to 100 years, we're going to see serious challenges to the sustainability of that system. They're going to be different social movements, both left and right, who will try to deal with these contradictions, the violence, the collapses that we're probably going to see in the next 50 to 100 years. And I guess I'm curious where animal advocates will sit within it. I'm obviously campaigning or asking for us to consider what a left animal advocacy would look like. But I'm also conscious that there's a big task, which is actually just about reforming the left, because I just don't actually think the left is up to the task of what's ahead. So there's multiple challenges. One thing I want to say firstly is that obviously I'd want animal advocacy to start thinking about developing a serious production politics. And that's not just about obviously producing more plant-based food and contesting animal-based food production, but the kind of economies we foresee that are going to actually produce flourishing, not just for humans, but non-humans as well. The second task is to convince the others of the left that that animals are part of the picture. One view that I put forward in the book is that, and it's something actually I think that's implicit in Marx, but kind of hidden, but certainly some green Marxists have highlighted this, is that capitalism is a kind of mechanism that will suck all life into it in order to produce value. That's its kind of function. And we're seeing this playing out today. Like there's literally this economic system that it isn't just about exploitation of human labor, it's actually all life will be sucked into this system and spat out to produce money. And from that standpoint, I think we have an important role as animal advocates. I think we have an important role in representing one side of where we need to go, which is around non-human animals and non-human life generally, and being part of that conversation. But I don't pretend, and this may come to the crux of what you're talking about, Alistair, I'm not pretending that it's going to be easy, and I'm not clear that I'm necessarily optimistic. I'm not clear that, I think we've got big challenges ahead. But given that we're all facing these challenges, so if you're concerned about climate change, then you're also going to be equally worried about our economic system and whether it's capable of meeting the challenge, then it's no different from that challenge. And I guess that's, to me, there's a usefulness in framing what we're doing in relation to that, both in terms of understanding comprehensively what are we dealing with when we look at something like the factory farm, but also the possibility of alliance, the possibility of actually engaging with other social movements in this conversation about where we're going, what sort of economy do we need that is going to look after the flourishing, not just of humans or some humans, but all of life. And how do we get there, right? And I think we have to be part of that conversation. Thanks, Alistair.
Thank you. I'll work my way up through some of the questions in the chat. Let's see. I'll go with Maria because she hasn't asked one yet. So I'll just read out Maria's question. She says it's a small question. Maria says, what I encountered when talking about animals as workers/laborers to a non-vegan audience, it felt as if the category of workers, especially to animals farmed for food, made it look as if it is an acceptable position because in capitalism, almost everyone is an exploited worker. How to mitigate this impression, right? Yeah, that kind of resonates.
Yeah, that's a great question, Maria. And it also, I guess it depends. Like I think there's been some work in animal labor which is interested in how do we use the idea of animals as laborers as a kind of an advocacy point to make normative claims about animals. So how can we, for example, imagine giving more rights to animals in production systems? To me, that's not helpful. And the reason that I'm particularly interested in the category of labour is that it analytically allows us to look at the factory farm in a particular kind of way in its history. So to me, that it's an analytic tool rather than necessarily an advocacy tool. That said, I think there's something interesting about thinking about animals as labourers. And one reason I think it's interesting is that one challenge with animal advocacy is that we often in our framing imagine animals as passive victims of the horrible violence that humans impose upon them, which is partly true, but we miss that actually animals are agents. That in this respect, animals are agents of production. They literally have been responsible for producing the wealth that we see before us. And insofar as animals have been forced to produce themselves as consumption commodities, they're literally responsible for reproducing the human labour force or human populations generally. Now, again, that's an analytic point, but what I'd say is that it allows us to understand animals as more than just passive materials, as they are actually agents of production. But I'd agree with your observations. I don't necessarily think it's useful to imagine animals as labour and use that as an organising point, beyond the kind of analytic point about what is the value that animals produce and how do we stop treating them as just simply raw materials within production. Great question, by the way.
Thanks, Dinesh. We've got just about 5 minutes maximum left. So I think there's 2 more questions in the chat. First one was from Corey again. Corey asks, she would like to know what Dinesh thinks about plans to genetically modify animals to reduce or remove their sentience. I remember some time back, Animal Ag was trying to develop chickens without cognitive awareness. This might also, it might be possible to wrap into that also, just if I may, like, where does like things like precision fermentation and lab meat figure into your thinking about confrontation between animals and fixed capital as well? Kind of maybe relates to that as well.
Yeah, I think both. I mean, so one way to think about it is these are, again, potentially attempts to make more efficient animal labour time. A cost so we think about those fantasies about removing the capacity for animals to feel pain. A cost for the industry is the fact that animals feel pain. And that this, if we think about it, this has become an organising point for animal welfare. And it imposes a material cost on industry because where they would like to just do whatever they want to animals, basic welfare prevents this. And no surprise then, scientists start coming up with ways to remove this element and realise the dream of production, which is the ultimate reduction of animal labour time without having to worry about whether animals suffer. So again, I think for me, just that framing about animal labour time analytically is really interesting for just thinking about what is driving this. I'd say also in relation to lab-grown meats, this is also another interesting example of the way in which attempts to minimise animal labour time produce experimentation. So in the case of lab-grown meat, at this point, as far as I understand, it's possible. I mean, it still involves, animals. It's possible, and you can reduce the amount of animals that are used, but it's only possible through massive and highly wasteful and inefficient use of fixed capital, like technology and energy to produce a very small quantity. And this is why, in a way, it's not going to happen anytime soon, as long as animal bodies are available en masse cheaply to produce meat. So this, in a sense, again, the kind of framing around animal labour time helps us to understand these phenomena, but also understand what are going to be the limits. So the future of lab-grown meat will rest upon the reduction of fixed capital costs so that it could vaguely be competitive with the factory farm. But of course, as I mentioned, because hierarchical anthropocentrism and the law and everything makes animal bodies available en masse cheaply, then it's going to be hard to compete with that, frankly, right? again, I might be proven wrong. I don't have a crystal ball, but that would be my guess. Yeah. So thanks. Great question.
Yeah. Thanks, Dinesh. We'll just finish, I think, with Colin had a second question here. He says, it's taken decades for gender and the impacts of sexism to be aligned with capitalism, and many are still not addressed, not taken as seriously as they need to be, including by the left. Do you foresee that it might take even longer for convincing the left to animals also need to be taken seriously, or at least even considered? Or do you think direct connections can be made clearer with the biodiversity and extinction crisis in the direct context of the climate emergency?
That's a great question. And again, I don't have a crystal ball. One thing I'd say is that there's often a framing around some of these questions, which assumes that there's this long process of convincing social movements to take up causes. And I'm not convinced that that's how things happen. I probably am more convinced by kind of Marx contradiction model, which is the idea that actually certain structural contradictions force upon us quite radical changes, sometimes in a very short period of time. Once again, we're in the midst of one, and I think climate change is exactly that. It's exactly a material contradiction that will force radical change. And again, I'd emphasize where we are, where animal advocates are in that story is going to be really important. Hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, there's some literature on it being an epochal crisis. I think Jason Moore talks about that. Okay, thank you very much. I think because we're now at 11:30, it would be unfair to to put Dinesh even even more difficult questions, and he's certainly given us some great answers to all the questions that have been put his way. So I just want to finish really by giving a huge thanks to Dinesh for such a high quality talk, and the discussion afterwards also being really high quality. So thanks. I'm clapping even though it's a virtual kind of environment.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Richard, and thanks for all the great engagement. I saw some fantastic comments in the chat. Bianca, the use of the phrase gondola is absolutely revolting and typical of animal agriculture. And Tom, yes, Hegel is in my mind too. Yeah. So thank you for all the great interaction and conversation.
Thanks. I think we'll be back in, I think it's September, our next talk. And I think this is from, if memory serves, Iris Bergman, another Australian-based scholar. So that's well worth looking out for via our website. Okay. Thanks very much, everybody. See you next time.
Thanks all.